BCBAs teach how to learn. This is a presentation about relational frame theory in collaboration with Level Ahead ABA.
My name is Shirley Sosa, and I am going to present about relational frame theory, teaching to learn. What's relational frame theory? Relational frame theory involves human language and cognition. Even though it has its similarities with verbal behavior, like Skinner described it, it's different because its cognitive and linguistic approach to language is a little bit different. Relational frame theory approaches verbal behavior as activities and not products. So what does this mean? It means that the verbal behavior that we know, it has a broad definition and it's mediated socially. In other words, it depends on the other person or the listener, how Skinner called it. And it's very limited because the definition that Skinner gave us has its functionality. It doesn't have functionality, without the history of another behavior. So it doesn't exist if the listener is not there. And when I'm talking about functionality, I'm not talking about the function of the behavior, but the functionality in the environment of that specific skill. Relational frame theory is also called framing, and it happens when an individual responds to one stimulus depending on in terms of another stimulus. The framing occurs also when multiple examples are taught of a single relation, and this provokes or this allows for more generalization in new examples and new relations to happen. Examples of the framing could be equivalence, opposites, or different. So let me give you an example with my dogs. So I used to feed them, but before feeding them, I will sing a song. And so that song will be the SD for them to go in front of the bowl, sit in front of the bowl and wait for the food. The food was not provided if they were not sitting in front of the bowl and they were not waiting for the food. But what happens if this situation of giving the food or this mechanism of giving the food becomes automatic? Years later, that's exactly what happened. I became a little bit lazy and I bought a food dispenser. So I was not feeding them anymore. So their behavior or the functionality of their behavior changed a little bit because it was not mediated by me anymore or by another person. It was mediated by the food dispenser. Us as behavior analysts, we comprehend all areas of behavior analysis in terms of functions of the behavior of the organism of interest. Here, I'm talking about functions of the behavior. When we're creating our behavior support plans or behaviors intervention plans, we create our interventions depending on what the function of the behavior is and not so much what how the other person will react. So by incorporating the behavior of another person, we are classifying that verbal behavior depending on the listener, but not so much as the speaker or the person who's doing the behavior. So if we follow the model of Skinner, when listening the word peanut butter and the child responds jelly sandwich, or just jelly, the definition of the verbal behavior might depend on the person who's saying it or on the listener. For example, if the mom says peanut butter and the child says and jelly sandwich, that is considered an intraverbal. But if it's said by a TV and they are just like the child is just looking at the pictures and they are just naming the pictures, that's considered a tact. So the classification of this behavior differs depending on the source of the stimulus, who is controlling that stimulus, despite of the fact that this child is responding exactly the same way in just two different scenarios. So this method of verbal behavior classification is according to the topographical properties and not their functionality. And again, here I'm talking about the functionality or the use of this skill in the environment. Another example that I have here is that let's say that we are teaching a child to tact a plate when you're showing a picture of a plate. I'm pretty sure that you guys are planning for generalization. So you are not only teaching them to tact a plate when showing a plate, but also when you're showing them a video, a real plate, when you're showing different plates, different colors. Of course, you're working with parents for them to tact a plate at home and with different pictures. But have you ever thought that if you present a child with a cutting board in a water bottle and you put food in front of the child, really food, do you think that the child will be able to make the relationship of which object is better to make a plate out of? Or do you think that they're going to problem solve that, of course, the cutting board is a better plate than a water bottle when an actual plate is not there? So that's why I invite you that to think about how you're programming and how rigid and rule governed we are programming.
Stay tuned for part 2.